Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Troublesome Tales, Volume 3, Story Number 1. This story is about a house we lived in 1986 in Southeast Texas. It's absolutely 100% true. I was 6 years old. The address was on Dyer Avenue. The thing I remember most about living here is the little girl. I do not know her name. All I know is she was always there. For years I thought she was one of my parents' friends' kid who my mother babysat or was always visiting, but she was always looking for her father. I remember her waking me up many a night to ask me where her dad was and when he was coming back. My parents usually had company, and I would get in trouble for sneaking out of bed at night to get a peek at who was over because the little girl was always asking about her father and when he would return for her. Shafin looked ill with dark rings around her eyes and pale skin. She had long blonde hair about the middle of her back with bangs, just like me. She wore a gray and white polka-dotted dress with a gray and white striped apron. Her shoes resembled what I call pilgrim shoes, with a big shiny buckle. Her socks were folded down and had lace around them at the ankle. For years, I thought this little girl was part of my childhood. When I asked my mother and father about what happened to her, they said they did not know what I was talking about. When I described her and her clothing, my parents turned white as a ghost and said, "You saw her too?" My mom and dad said they would pass by my bedroom and see what they thought was me sitting in front of the toy box in my room playing, but then pass by the kitchen window and see my sister and I playing in the backyard. When they go to my room to see who was playing at the toy box, toys would be strewn about, but nobody would be there. These are memories that not only I have, but my mother and father as well. My sister was too young to remember the house or anything about it. Strange things happened there. Something would lock the dog up in the laundry room. The door had a latch that latched from the inside, but the dog was constantly getting locked in the room and barking and wailing like it was being beat. The dog barked at certain spots in the house and was always on edge and growling and gnashing his teeth at something we couldn't see. There were sounds from the attic like stomping and banging. Sometimes it sounded like something was being dragged across the floor above our heads. My dad would go up in the middle of the night trying to find out what was causing the noises. Nothing was ever found, not so much as a raccoon or a squirrel. Something blacked both of my dad's eyes one night when all the power went out. He accused my mom of blacking his eyes, but she says he was trying to drown her in the bathtub during the power outage. Neither was near each other at the time of the power outage. They were both on opposite ends of the house. Their bedroom caught on fire 4 times in the year we lived there. I've had many more strange experiences in my life, but I will never forget the little girl that eternally lives at my childhood home. I think about her often, and I wonder if she ever found her father. Story number 2. This happened back when I was 17. It was mid-October, nearing Halloween. My family and I had gone to a really small, fairly rural town to meet a group of family friends for dinner and catching up for old time's sake, as my siblings and I had grown up with the children of the other families. After dinner, the parents stayed at the bar drinking, and those of us that weren't of legal drinking age were starting to get a little bored. That's when one of my friends brought up the cemetery. Apparently, there's a cemetery in this town that's said to be haunted. I think some ghost hunter, paranormal type show did an episode about it or something. But the legends are said to have been around since before that. The story goes that a group of teenage boys wandered into the graveyard one Halloween night with the intention of causing trouble and maybe stirring up some spooky ghost action in celebration of Halloween. After dicking around for a while with no unexplained phenomena, they decided to sit on top of this mausoleum, which is basically just a big tomb built up around a coffin, instead of actually burying it in the ground. They were about to call it quits and head home when all of a sudden unseen hands seemed to push one of the boys off the top of the tomb and onto the ground. All the boys were obviously scared shitless and hightailed it out of there. All of them described feeling an eerie, ominous energy following them around for weeks after the incident. There have also been numerous reports of orbs, headstones inexplicably moving or disappearing, Ghostly apparitions, inscriptions being changed, flashes of light, strange noises, the whole works. I, of course, was more than excited to check it out. We arrived at the cemetery well after dark, and one of my girlfriends, we'll call her Emma, and I were the only two brave enough to go in. We hopped out of the car, careful to be as inconspicuous as we could since we didn't want the police showing up and ruining our ghost hunting experience, and headed towards the entrance. It was chilly and a bit windy, as autumn in Wisconsin tends to be. We gripped each other's hands and started down the gravel path. As soon as we passed the fence that surrounded the plot of land, everything seemed to get very still and quiet. We couldn't even hear the wind anymore, which was strange, as it had definitely been breezy as we got out of the car. It was so silent that even whispering and our steps in the gravel seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Though there were no lights in or near the cemetery, there was enough moonlight filtering through the clouds to allow us to see pretty well. We soon realized we had no idea where the fabled haunted mausoleum was, but kept walking anyway. We made a random left turn, and lo and behold, there it was, about 30 yards in front of us. Pretty good luck, right? As we approached, I began to feel almost an electric sort of energy in my fingers and hands, but I wrote this off as just nerves, or maybe something having to do with breaking the law. We reached the tomb, and this thing is huge. It was twice my height, at least, and made of weathered gray stone with moss and lichen growing sparsely on it. We stared for a moment, and Emma whispered, "You should touch it." Being the badass ghost hunter I am, I obliged. There's really nothing remarkable about the cool roughness of the stone, so I decided to take it a step further and hop up to sit on the lip of the curved top of the thing. Again, nothing happened, so I jokingly whispered, or loudly, "If there's anyone here, any spirits or anything, come on out." After listening in silence for a second, I think, oh well. I made my way to the very top of where that kid was rumored to have been pushed off by ghostly hands. Emma snapped a picture or two before I climbed back down. Slightly disappointed by the lack of spooky encounters, we agreed to head out and were about to do that when we saw a pair of headlights slowly creeping down the road that bordered one side of the graveyard. We immediately assumed someone noticed us and called the cops, so we crouched down behind some bushes with the mausoleum directly to our left to hide us. Both of us were completely silent except our breathing as we watched the vehicle slowly make its way down the street. I watched its taillights turn the corner when I heard a low, creepy, menacing laugh coming from my back to the right. It sounded so strange, like it was a few feet away, but also right in my ear. I freaked out, and I was going to chalk it up to some kind of adrenaline-induced hallucination when Emma, who's standing to my left, whispers, "Hey, did you hear that?" My blood ran cold as I slowly nodded a silent yes, I did. I cautiously turned my head to the direction I heard it come from, and I shit you not, I saw a dark figure stand up from one of the headstones, not 10 feet away from us. I screamed bloody murder and somehow ended up on the ground, as the next thing I know, Emma's pulling at my arm shouting, "We have to run! We need to get out of here! Come on, we have to go!" I let her pull me to my feet and lead me blindly by the hand. We were full out sprinting, tripping over gravestones and plants and who knows what else in the dark, and we can't even find the exit in our panic. We finally reached a gap in the fence, and I can feel tears streaming down my face as I was running for my life down the middle of the road, not even paying attention to the oncoming headlights until I nearly ran into them. Luckily, it was a car containing the rest of our friends, and we ripped the door open, threw ourselves inside screaming, "Go, go! Please, just drive!" before we even bothered to sit in an actual seat or shut the door. I can't remember who was driving, but I think our panic and terror shook them enough that they did what we asked and sped away back to the bar. They kept asking us what happened and if we were okay, but we couldn't calm down enough to answer until we were back inside the bar and we had sat down. Still shaking and out of breath, we recounted our story to all of them, drunk parents included. I think a lot of them were pretty skeptical, and honestly, I would have been too if I hadn't experienced it myself. In the weeks that followed, I felt that same eerie energy the boys in the legend described hanging over my head. Personally, I attributed it more to paranoia after being scared out of my mind by something I couldn't actually see then some kind of curse, but it made me feel uneasy nonetheless. It's been a few years since this happened, and I still can't think of a single logical explanation for what happened that night. While I have no idea how credible anyone else's reported experience with this place was, I know we were without a doubt the only people in that graveyard, or even on the streets for that matter, and we would have heard someone trying to sneak up on us. The sound of that laugh was so unnatural. I can't get it out of my head even now. I've never been more scared than I was that night, and I now know that what people mean when they talk about not being able to fully believe in the paranormal until you've experienced it firsthand. Well, I can say I'm one of those now. Next story. My mother told me a story about an experience her older brother had. This took place on the Crow Reservation in Montana, along the highway between Hardin and Crow Agency in the 1960s. My uncle was in a car with about 3 other people that night. They were heading back from a party when they saw something standing on a highway mile marker. It stunned them to the point they pulled over to go back and look. 3 of them, including my uncle, saw it. The 4th, a lady whose name I can't remember, refused to look even at their insistence. My uncle told my mother it looked demonic, like what people today would describe as a wendigo, but it was not exceptionally tall. It jumped from the mile marker into the hills. He thought it was cool and interesting. My mother said he needed to pray for protection. I guess he didn't. Everyone who looked at that thing died within 3 years. My uncle was the first, having died within a year. The girl who didn't look told my mother decades later that she thinks it was a death omen. She's passed away now too. My mother has told me many stories about how her mother supposedly casted out demons and she would witness it. People on the reservation would often seek out my grandmother to ask for healing prayers. There was one claimed that she brought a child who had been declared dead for over 20 minutes back to life. Another woman from the tribe boasted that she had set out a spirit to kill my grandmother using the old ways, but it failed to do so. Within a month, that woman ended up dying. It's said that since the spirit failed to do its task, it then killed its summoner. Next story. I will start by giving a brief description of the house in which I grew up in, and then I will share an experience of my dad's. As far back as I can remember, the house was always very active, very creepy, and no matter where you walked in that house, you would always feel as though you were being watched. Right from a very early age, I had experienced creepy things myself, and it seemed like everyone in the household had a story to tell. Even friends of the family who would watch the house whenever we would go away on holiday would often call up to apologize, saying they were too frightened to stay inside the house any longer. I've seen things thrown. I've heard somebody whistling a tune coming from up the stairs, and that's while I'm in the house, completely alone. Any family pets that we ever had would go completely crazy for no reason whatsoever, snarling at thin air with all their hair standing on end. We had horrendous smells, unexplainably, just appear on the stairs, then disappear. This thing even began to speak, in a woman's voice. It actually said the words Gary, which is my dad's name. Hopefully that gives you a better picture of what this house was like to live in. The story I will now share is one of my dad's personal experiences, and I will only say that I have no reason not to believe him. My dad is a very forward-thinking, level-headed guy that will always look for a reasonable explanation first before jumping to any conclusions. At the time of this experience, I must also mention that my mom and dad were going through a divorce, and at this point I was living with my mom while my older brother and sister had already left home. My dad was now living alone inside the house, and like any other night, he would religiously make a point of walking around the entire house just before bed, making sure that all the doors were locked and all the electric appliances were turned off at the wall. He then walked up the stairs and climbed into bed for the night. He was laid there for about 15 or 20 minutes trying to drift off, when out of nowhere he heard the distinctive sound of the bedroom door pushing against the carpet, as if someone had just walked in the room, and he said that his eyes instantly shot wide open and all the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He lay there still staring at the wall and far too scared to turn over. He was completely petrified. He then heard pressure being applied on the carpet walk from the doorway and all the way down to the foot of his bed, stopping roughly where his head was positioned. My dad is quite a tough guy, but even he admits there was no way he was going to roll over to check who or what this was. So instead, he faced the wall all night, with his covers pulled around his face. He just laid awake for the rest of the night, waiting for the sun to come through the bedroom window. Eventually, when the sun did finally come back up, he rolled over to find nobody else in the room with him. However, the bedroom door was still left wide open, and to this day he simply has no explanation for what happened that night, or even who was in that room with him. All he knows is that 100% certainty it happened, and it scared the living life out of him. Next story. Well, my mom and dad were divorced when I was young, and I lived with my mom. My brother and I would stay at my dad's every Wednesday and every weekend. He lived with an old schoolhouse in Cheshire. My brother and I were petrified in this house. Although my dad saw and heard things, he never got scared or let on. I never personally saw things thrown, but he did. So did my grandparents. The kitchen was a hot spot. We would often hear chatting of more than one person coming from there, but couldn't distinguish any specific words. There would be footsteps and doors opening and closing without reason on a regular basis. One day my grandmother was dusting the top of a corner cupboard, tall wooden antique piece of furniture. She could just about reach the top of it with her arm stretched up, and must have accidentally pulled it towards her when she leaned back down. The thing started to fall on her, and literally, invisibly, something pushed the cupboard back upright. My gran thinks it was the ghost child protecting her. One day when we were packing the car to go on holiday, my brother, myself, and my dad were going back and to from the house to the car. I was about 10 and my brother 12. I had been lazy and playing in the kitchen for a bit, and my brother came in to get more things. "How did you get in here?" he asked. I said, "I've been here for a bit." He said, "You couldn't have been," because he had just been talking to me outside by the car. We both freaked out and ran to find my dad. To this day, it terrifies us, and my brother still distinctly remembers talking to the ghost girl and thinking it was me. Next story. When I was about 6, we moved into this house in Macon, Missouri that sat empty for years and was relatively cheap. We had an old pump well next to the house that we ended up burying due to it being a hazard. I think my first experience happened about a week after moving into the house when it got really cold one night and my space heater stopped working. In the entryway of my bedroom stood a figure of a bald man in a big coat. I thought I was seeing things until my stepsister said she saw a little girl in her closet. Some other signs I picked up when I was young was when my brother and I were home alone, when our parents were at work at night, and the dogs would start barking at nothing and the sounds of plates rattling could be heard in the kitchen. We would walk in there and discover that nothing was actually happening. Everything became a blur for years, until one day my mom and I were cleaning our loft, and a shelf of books almost dropped on us in my brother's bedroom. Door slammed closed. The next night my brother and I were watching Die Hard, and our television and speakers all turned off at once and then came back on. We had to leave to Walmart with our mom about an hour later to test if it was some kind of blackout. We turned off everything in the house to return 30 minutes later with every light and television in the house turned on. For a long time I was afraid to sleep upstairs by myself unless my brother came with me due to tons of activity being upstairs. My stepdad told me that he saw the curtains on our French doors move by themselves some nights. One of my last experiences was when I was in 6th grade. I was leaving to go to school, and as I passed the room, I saw a figure on the wall. It turned to me and shouted, "Get out!" before the door sporadically slammed in my face. We eventually moved out of the house, unrelated to the paranormal activity. As I got older, I started doing research on the house and discovered some gruesome things about the past tenants. One of the things I found that it was built on top of where another house stood, which seemed like a common thing to do back in the day. The previous house probably had something to do with the Civil War. A few houses around us were old hospitals, so I'm guessing the old house was one or the other. The current house was built around 1900 and was turned into an apartment complex for a brief period of time. My old room was a kitchen with a fridge outlet still there, and my closet was the old pantry. Sometime in the early 1900s, a little girl of a family who lived in the house fell down the pump well I mentioned in the story and she died. A number of soldiers also lost their lives on the property, as I've seen apparitions. Now, I mentioned that the buried house may have been some other type of house that burned down, or maybe a hospital for soldiers. The bald man in the big coat was someone who either died in the house or around the property, as we found old bloodstains in the basement, and we don't know who they belonged to. There's quite a huge gap of owner history with the house. I believe in the last 10 years we have been the last people to live there, and I believe the house stood empty, and we really don't know who owned it before us either, as the house was there empty without tenants or owners for many years, maybe decades. The full history on the house isn't quite so clear either, so there's no definite answer as to who those ghosts might be. Next story. When I was 19, I lived in a haunted house. That's a big statement, but let me tell you the story, then you can decide for yourself. My grandmother had just passed away. She and my grandfather both died in this house. That really didn't bother me. They were wonderful, calm people. I loved them, and they loved me. And to me, death is not really final. So when my parents were looking to sell the property, but needed time to go through all the belongings, I volunteered to stay there as a caretaker until they could organize the estate sale. I was home from college for a summer and thought living alone would be far better than attempting to reacquire my room from my stepdad, who had converted it into an office. So I moved in to help them organize, make sure the home was clean and serviced, etc. I had taken care of both of my grandparents as they passed and had no qualms about being in the house whatsoever. My parents had already been working hard before my arrival, boxing up my grandparents' 70 plus years plus another 50 years of marriage. They took all the personal and valuable items from other rooms and began stacking them in the master suite where my grandparents died. Because of this, I decided to sleep on the couch in the living room on the opposite side of the wall from the headboard of the bed in the master bedroom. The bedroom had a narrow hallway inside the piles of boxes that led to the walk-in closet and bathroom, and this is where I stored my belongings. Other than that closet space and the hallway, the rest of the rooms, walls, windows, corners, and even the tub and showers were all inaccessible. From almost the first week, something felt off. The house had always been a great place to be, warm and friendly. Though it still looked entirely the same, it felt completely different, like a stranger's house. But I went about my business anyway, thinking I was still grieving or weirded out, though I didn't feel like I was. Then things started to happen. The first thing was the heavy light fixture above the dining table that swung constantly. It would throw weird shadows at night, until eventually I unscrewed the bulb, worried about it shorting out. Then the landline phone, which had always worked just fine, would only produce static. I even bought a new phone and plugged it in, but still only got static. The phone lines were checked and rechecked by the phone company and no problem could be found. I ended up having to buy a cell phone just so that I could communicate with my family. Next, the brand new refrigerator broke down and all my food rotted while I was away for a 2-day trip. I came back to a foul, stinking house and a giant puddle of sludge on the kitchen floor. The problem was a faulty compressor, which was replaced. A few days later, the new one also quit. It was again replaced until it stopped. Another new fridge was out of the question, and so for weeks I lived out of ice chest, eating soggy microwave dinners and fast food. Next, the sink, showers, and laundry machines began to spew sewage. One day, I walked into the kitchen and was hit with a wall of stench. As I stood there, this thick black sludge began to fill the sink, soaking all the dishes. It spilled out onto the floor. I took a plunger to it, and it stopped. I scrubbed the dishes and the sink, mopped the floor, went back to life, only to have the floor of the shower begin filling with black sludge as I was standing in it. Then, when I attempted to run a load of laundry, the machine began to rattle. I opened it thinking it was off balance, except the machine wasn't filled with water. It was filled with something more like mud that smelled like excrement. I didn't even know plumbing could do that to a washer. They're hooked to fresh water lines, not to drainage lines. I called a plumber. The pipes were dragged all the way to the main line, and some replaced just to rule them out. But the plumber was confused as hell. When he looked in the washing machine, the look on his face was half shocked and half accusatory. He asked me how it got like that. I said, "That's what you're here to tell me." He shook his head. All the pipes were accessible, as they ran through a basement and could be open examined, and he could not find any blockages or reasons sewage would be coming from what was always fresh water pipe. I began to wonder, had this been going on all along, and my grandmother just never said anything? But that couldn't be, because my stepdad had lived with her before that, and we had often stayed here. The house was only built in the late 40s and was always kept immaculately by my grandparents, the very first owners. If there had been a major problem, there's no way my fastidious grandma would let it go. She grew up in the Depression. For her, a home was an investment to be tended. I just chalked it up to everything having an expiration date, and maybe when Grandma went, it timed out to everything else going. Then the television began turning itself off. I'd be watching the news and bam, no TV. Checked the set for any kind of timer, nope. Began timing between stoppages, no consistency. Then my stereo decided to do as it pleased, either refusing to play CDs or skipping randomly through songs. The radio gave off static. My computer monitor shorted out repeatedly. I thought, okay, it's electrical. I had a master electrician out to check the wiring. No problem with current, and I was informed it had been redone in the 80s. He even punched a hole in the wall and took apart the breaker box. Then one day, I got an invitation to go out with friends. I squeezed into the master suite, fetched my outfit out of the closet. It was dark. I reached out with my left hand and stroked the wall to locate the light switch, but couldn't find it. Finally, it occurred to me that it might be on the other wall. I reached for the wall to my right, but before I could even touch a switch, the lamp across the room came on. I thought, oh, I must have bumped the switch, until I had the sudden realization that the lamp was not connected to the light switch. The light switch controlled the ceiling fixture only. I pushed and moved boxes to get to the lamp, sitting on top of a pile of books, and examined it. I discovered it was not a switch lamp. It was a tap lamp, one of those ones that can only be turned on if it's touched directly, and it was plugged into a socket that had absolutely nothing to do with the light switch. The only way I could have turned it on was to wade through all the boxes and touch it with my bare hand. Only I hadn't. I got my clothes and left. Called my dad from my new cell phone, and he nonchalantly instructed me to go back into the bedroom and say, "Thank you." To him it was a hilarious joke. He didn't believe me, and as a Christian minister, did not believe his parents would bother haunting me. Only I never said the house was haunted. I said that weird things were happening, and I wanted help figuring them out, not jokes or superstitions. I think I realized I was on my own. Things got progressively worse. All the time my feeling of the house was getting darker. Even before the lamp, I had the distinct impression I was being watched by someone who became progressively angrier with me. If you've never felt the I am being watched feeling, it's very similar to walking into a room where you immediately know a serious conversation was being had, but no one wants you to know what it's about. There's a feeling of knowing the weight of their thoughts. I could be in the kitchen, happy and fine, when all of a sudden I would have a sense that someone truly enraged by me had just walked into the room behind me. More than a few times it took everything I had just to turn around. There was never anyone there. Soon my friends refused to visit. Some of them told me it was the TV turning off. Some told me they heard noises, and some just plain wouldn't discuss it beyond saying it was a terrible place, and they couldn't be paid to stay there. Can you imagine it? You have a house all to yourself and can't find a single teenager or early 20-something who wants to throw a party? You call them and say, "Hey, let's hang out. Set up the band and we'll have a keg," only to be asked, "Is this at your place?" "Yeah, no, we don't need to party." There I was, alone in the house, feeling more and more paranoid as the sensation of being watched, followed, and punished worsened. The appliances failing or turning off, no fresh water, rancid food that I couldn't keep fresh, light swinging and flickering, a phone that wouldn't work, that began to ring spontaneously until I jerked it out of the wall, my entertainment being taken from me by a constant mischievous entity that wanted to torture me. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Then I remembered an incident that had happened about 7 years prior, because finally I was willing to consider that the house was abnormal. I had been staying with my grandmother during summer break because she knew a little neighbor girl who was my age. We slept in the upstairs art studio like permanent sleepover, and were having a great time until about the third or fourth day. We were playing with some clay my grandmother had when my friend, let's call her Rosa, went down to wash her hands in the bathroom, but never came back. I eventually wondered what happened to her, since all of her stuff was still upstairs and she said nothing about going home. I went down and couldn't find her anywhere. I asked my grandmother, who said she run out the door a few minutes ago. I walked over to Rosa's house, wondering if I'd done something to make her mad. When I knocked, she answered the door. She had a look on her face that was blank and taut. She told me she wanted to be my friend, but that she didn't want to stay in the house anymore. She didn't want to play there or go over. After a long time of asking, I finally got her to tell me why she walked down the stairs to the bathroom, and while washing her hands, she saw a reflection in the mirror of someone walking across the hall behind her. Rosa thought it was my grandma and turned around to ask her if she could have a soda, and realized the figure was a man. Knowing that no man lived in the house, she had only just moved there and my grandfather had been dead for over a year, she followed him to find out who he was. He walked into the living room and she trailed behind, was about to say hello when the figure turned and walked right through the fireplace. I stood there disbelieving until Rosa said it was an elderly man and described him. My grandfather was tall, thin, and missing 2 fingers from his left hand. So was the man Rosa saw. I got angry because I was sure she was playing a cruel joke. Sure, she'd never met my Gramps, but her uncle had, and he lived with her. He must have told her what he looked like, and now she was playing a prank on me. I told her she was being mean and stormed home. We never really talked again. Now, sitting in the house, feeling more and more freaked out and helpless since I couldn't get my parents to listen to me, I wondered if it could be my Gramps. He was literally the nicest man I had ever known, and though he'd been in the Navy in World War II, I just couldn't imagine him wanting to hurt me or anyone else. Then it occurred to me that it might be something pretending to be him. At this point, I felt so beset I was willing to entertain this as a notion. My dad was a minister. I thought maybe he would know of something I didn't, and really, I was grasping at straws, handling all of this alone. I sat my dad down and outlined all the things I'd been feeling and seeing. I showed him my logbook of all the bumps and sounds, their times and dates. His response was both rage and insults. He told me I needed help and stormed out. Feeling like I needed someone to listen to me, I went to my neighbor and told him. He knew I hadn't been sleeping, borrowing 4 or 5 movies only to return them the next day because I'd been up all night watching them, so I wouldn't be alone in the dark. I'd been living in sweltering heat, the AC was broken, eating sandwiches, broken fridge, my dad just gave up on that, having fewer and fewer visitors and washing my hair with a hose in the driveway. My neighbor told me he believed me, that he knew something bad was happening, and told me that if I wanted to stay with his family, I could. My food was at his house. I often showered there. I did my laundry there, and he came over and looked at every mechanical malfunction I presented. And even as a contractor, he couldn't figure out half of it. I might as well have stayed at his place. But I was stubborn and was determined to show my stepdad I could handle the stress without turning into a hysterical nut job. Finally, it was my last night. I couldn't wait to leave. All my belongings were packed and waiting beside the front door. I laid down on the couch and felt restless. I just couldn't wait to get the hell out. Without warning, there was a tremendous slamming sound against the wall above my head. It was so heavy and powerful, the wall shook and the frame oil painting, 3 feet wide, rattled against the wall. I bolted upright. Then there was a second loud bang from somewhere else in the master bedroom. I grabbed my cell and backed into the kitchen so that I could watch the master suite door from the block of butcher knives. The loud noises continued as if someone was in the room, just throwing the boxes against the walls and doors. No breaking glass, no crashing, just loud single thuds. I called 911 and the operator listened with me. She too heard the banging and told me that I should make sure I was in a safe place with my back to a wall. I told her I had a knife and told her to please hurry it up. I asked if I should go outside. She told me not to, as they had probably gotten in from the windows and might even have accomplices. The police came to the back door. As soon as I let them in, the banging stopped dead. They went through the bedroom and then the whole house with no success. They led me into the bedroom and it was exactly as I'd left it. Not a thing was out of place. I stood there stunned. They checked the windows right in front of me, showing that they were locked. I have to explain that the house is off the ground by about 4 feet, meaning that even if a burglar had wanted to get in from a window, a ladder would have been essential. Yet there was no ladder. I was so surprised I think they tried to make me feel better by saying, "We saw a kitten run out from under the house. Maybe you had a cat in your wall." I looked at the cop with my mouth hanging open and saw the helpless, sheepish stare. The only was that was a cat, as if they were in every wall, I said. It was so loud and so hard it made the door shake and the painting move. But they couldn't tell me anything else, and shrugged their shoulders. When they drove away, I dragged my suitcase outside, locked the door and sat on the porch until sunrise, wrapped in a blanket. Finally, I got out of that house and instantly felt better. It was as if I'd broken up with an abusive ex, or I'd come to school to find the kid who picked on me had moved away. I told my parents, who had gone silent upon the subject, to sell the place as soon as they could and went back to college trying to forget that summer alone in that freaky house. Unfortunately, it wasn't through with me. About a week or so later, my stepdad called and demanded to know if I'd given the house keys out to any of my friends. I was offended, I had gone through hell to take care of that stupid house, and I was being accused of giving out keys. I told him that there was one set and he had it, and that if he wanted to question my integrity, maybe he should go spend the night there. He said fine and hung up. A few days later, I got an email from my neighbor. It began with, "I don't know what you'll think of this, but," and went from there. First, he said that 2 nights after I left the house, he and his family had been awakened by loud screaming, banging, and flashing lights. He got up and walked outside to the end of the driveway. Several other neighbors were gathered in their driveway, all looking at my grandma's house. He went over to them and asked them what was happening. They had no idea, but had called the cops. Meanwhile, lights and noises continued to emit from the house. He said it was as if a party was going on and someone was running through the house turning lights on and off. The police arrived, but the doors and windows were locked and they couldn't get inside. They asked my neighbor to call my parents and find out who they had allowed to enter the premises. My stepdad showed up angry and half asleep. By then the lights and sounds had stopped. Most of the neighbors had returned to bed. The cops waited for my dad to unlock the house and checked it. Nothing had moved. It had been largely clean. The television had been unplugged and there was no stereo. The cops interrogated my stepdad and told him to have a talk with me. He refused to believe I had given anyone keys and so hadn't contacted me. But 2 days later it happened again. This time my neighbor told the others not to bother with the police and instead called my stepdad first. Dad again drove out at about 4 a.m. and checked the house. It was as before. That was when he had finally called me. But there was more. The day my dad called me, my neighbor had been home during the day for lunch. The mailman came, so he walked down and said hello, taking the mail from him by hand. The mailman pointed to Grandma's house and said, "So, who's there now?" "No one lives there now. She went back to school." This is a small town. I've known that mailman for years. He was a family friend. He knew my circumstances and that I had gone back to my university. "No, I don't mean that. I mean, who's there right now, like in the house?" My neighbor was confused. "You mean living there?" "No, in the house." He pointed to the upstairs room, which had a picture window. My neighbor glanced back. "Well, the house is vacant, and I think they're going to put it on the market, so there shouldn't be anyone there." The mailman laughed. "Then who is that right there?" He pointed insistently. Worried the mailman was losing his mind, my neighbor asked, "What do you see?" The mailman became angry. "Look in the window. There's a man in that window." Except there was no man that my neighbor could see. He said he immediately got goosebumps, told the mailman he'd take care of it, and went back inside. A Called my stepdad and got into an argument for his troubles. My stepdad refused to believe anything was wrong, and that it must somehow be either my fault or a burglar who wouldn't get anything since the house was completely empty. My neighbor defended me and told my stepdad to get the house blessed or sell it ASAP. Then he hung up and emailed me. I sat there reading it, playing back the story of the elderly man my friend Rosa had seen. No one else had owned the house before my grandparents. They were the first owners, buying the home when it cost a whopping $7,000. It couldn't be him, but it couldn't be anyone else either. I was stumped. My parents sold the house. We never spoke of it again. To this day, if I mention it, my dad gets angry with me. But I did get him to admit that he had personally blessed the house before selling it. It made him a cool couple $100,000, being an arts and crafts house in a central neighborhood, and the new owners, to my knowledge, never had any of the troubles I did. I still have no explanation for anything I experienced there, and words don't accurately express how alone, cold, and miserable it made me. It was oppressive. It had me literally crying, a mirror in my pocket so that I could check around corners or over my shoulder. I slept with the lights on or in the daytime. I started talking to myself to pretend there was someone else there with me. I stayed out as much as I could, but when you live in a haunted house and everyone knows it, no one wants to see you on their doorstep at 2 a.m. I am a rational person. I still don't believe in ghosts. I don't think it was my grandparents. It didn't feel like them. I think it was something else. I think it waited for my grandmother to leave. When she did, it decided the house belonged to it, and it forced me out. I really don't care. It can have it, whatever it wants.